Hi, this is Adrian Fielding again. This is the third lecture in this series on game design fundamentals. In this one I'm going to look at a brief history of non-digital games. Before I begin there, I'm going to be putting up a Google Drive folder with some material that we might find useful in this course, such as when we get onto the game design document, I'll put up some templates there, some good examples of existing game design documents, that sort of stuff. So if you could send me your email address, I'll invite you to that folder. My email address is adrianfielding@gmail.com. I'll put that in the link below this video at the end. So why are we looking at the history of non-digital games? By non-digital or board games, what I mean is anything that isn't a video game, really. A video game is just a game that's played on a screen. Anything else, be it a card game, an actual board game, chess, or something like Dungeons and Dragons, which doesn't have a board at all, I'm going to refer to them either as non-digital games or board games. There's the Guardian newspaper calls this time now the golden age of board games. There's been a kind of renaissance in board games in the past few years, and this is mainly down to the invention of crowdfunding websites such as Kickstarter and Indiegogo. These allow game designers to apply for funding on the website by putting up, say, a game design document, a video of a playthrough of a prototype, the mechanics or the rules of the game, and to apply for funding of the general public. The first board game to really become popular through this method was the Cards Against Humanity game, which made $15,000 in funding in 2012. This is a graph, not a graph, this is a table of the most funded board games on Kickstarter. As you can see there, the most popular one we've talked about in the last lecture, and I will be coming back to it, is Exploding Kittens, which has 219,000 backers and made $8.8 million in funding. That is the most backers of any project that was ever put on a crowdfunding website. As you can see, there's the top 10. They've all made over $2 million in funding. By looking at board games, it also is a great way of having a good look at the mechanics and the dynamics of games. It's a lot easier to look at them on a board game than it is on most video games. If you remember when we were in Greece, I drew the diagram on the board there of the MDA framework, which is mechanics, dynamics, and aesthetics. The mechanics are basically the rules of the game. The dynamic would be the type of game it is and how people play that. The one that we had on the first day there was the race to the end. The race to the end is a dynamic. It's how people play the game. And then the aesthetics is the emotion that you want the user to feel at the end of the game or while they're playing the game. It's also important to have a good knowledge of the history of the games that you're trying to create, both non-digital or digital. I would definitely be on the course that I do at LIT. We study a lot of the history of games. We examine the digital video games from the past so that we can create games and draw on what's gone before and use that in our games. So onto the history. One of the earliest examples of a board game is called Senet, and it was found in ancient Egypt in burial sites from 3500. The image on the left there is from Queen Nefertari's tomb. The hieroglyphics in her tomb showed her playing this game. The image on the right is an intact set of Senet that was found in the tomb of Tutankhamun. The Senet game board is a grid of 30 squares arranged in 3 rows of 10. The board has 2 sets of pawns. The rules have been put together over years through finding scripts and texts unearthed from ancient Egypt. So the mechanics are as follows. The players throw sticks to see how many squares they move the piece forward. If you throw a 1, a 4, or a 6, you get an extra turn. You can't land on one of your own pieces. If you land on another player's piece, you can switch places with them. However, you can't switch with them if they have 2 or more pieces in a row. If the other player has 3 or more pieces in a row, you can't pass them. Some squares are safe squares, and some are danger squares. And the first player to get all their pieces off the board wins. The board game Go was invented in ancient China 2,500 years ago, and it's the oldest board game that is still being played to this day. It's actually more popular now than it's ever been. This is due to it being used as a test for computer artificial intelligence. If you remember back in 1997, there was a big chess match between Garry Kasparov and a computer called Deep Blue to test whether computers could beat humans at board games. And the result of that was that the computer Deep Blue did indeed beat Garry Kasparov. Go is a simple game, but it has a lot more moves available to the player than chess, and is therefore seen as more complex. And it's the new test for computer artificial intelligence. Last year, a computer called AlphaGo, which was developed by Google, played the leading Go player in the world and beat him in all but one of the games. 2 other games that have their origins in ancient times are backgammon, which is obviously still played today. Its origins are in ancient Rome from 2000 BC. It remains very much unchanged to this day. I think the only differences are, 3 dice and the pieces start off the board. It had a big resurgence in the 1960s there, and it's still played in many places. Pubs and cafes around the world still play backgammon to this day. And then chess evolved from Tafel, which was an ancient Germanic game from 400 AD, where the one player controlled the king in the centre of the board and the other players controlled pawns who had to take the king. It evolved over time with influences from all over the world. The earliest chess sets were found in 600 AD. We're going to jump forward in time now to 1903, and a game called The Landlord's Game. This was invented in America by a woman named Lizzie McGee. It's one of the first examples of a game that was designed to educate people on a theory or a point. Lizzie's aim was to teach people the Henry George theory of single taxation, which says that land is owned by the public and rented to individuals or firms, and they pay a property tax on the land, and then they eliminate the taxes on labour and capital earnings. The game board consisted of a square track with a row of properties around the outside that players could buy. The board had 4 railroads, 2 utilities, a jail, and a corner which earned players $100 every time they passed it. In 1935, Lizzie McGee sold the rights to this game to the Parker Games Company, who of course turned it into Monopoly and went on to make millions out of it, and also went on to produce games like Trivial Pursuits. She sold the patent to Parker for $500. Dungeons and Dragons 1974, originally created by Gary Gygax of USA. We luckily got a chance to play this, so I don't really need to explain how it's played. It's influenced by the Lord of the Rings with the elves and the hobbits and the wizards and the spellcasting and such like. It was also popular for the introduction of the multi-sided dice, which for game design come in really useful when you're prototyping, having use of dice with 20 sides or 12 sides rather than just a 6-sided dice gives you a lot more leeway in how people roll and what they're rolling for. It's been a huge influence on popular culture since then, particularly in video games. Baldur's Gate, which is an old game from the early 1990s, which you can now get on the iPad and on Android, is set in the world of Dungeons and Dragons, uses the exact same rule set. The great thing about the Dungeons and Dragons rules is that they really transpose well to a computer. A computer takes the role of the dungeon master and behind the scenes makes all these rolls, comes up with the random numbers, checks your armor, checks the enemy, and resolves the battles for you. World of Warcraft, which is at one point had 10 million subscribers paying €15 a month to play, directly influenced by Dungeons and Dragons. The Final Fantasy series, which is on I think number 15 or 16 now, multi-million selling game from game series from Japan. The Game of Thrones TV series has direct links. The author of the Game of Thrones novels was a big fan of Dungeons and Dragons, and even right up to the newer games now, such as Mass Effect Andromeda, which was released this year, the Fallout series, all have their roots in the Dungeons and Dragons game. The next game we're going to look at is Settlers of Catan, otherwise known as Catan. By 1995, the state of board games had become a bit drab. There wasn't really any evolution. People used to get out the Monopoly sets at Christmas or the Trivial Pursuits. There wasn't really any advances until the birth of what was known as the Euro games. The most famous of these, and one of the first, was the Settlers of Catan, which was designed by Klaus Tauber in Germany and was released in 1995. This game introduced new mechanics which hadn't been seen before in board games. It was the birth of the resource management game, where the players gathered resources and gave them the ability to trade between each other with these resources. The resource trading was done between the players. There was no rules in the game that defined how they had to do this trade. It's whatever they agreed upon. The game was made in a way that you had to cooperate with the other players and do trades in some way in order to win the game. This is known as the meta game. It's a game within a game. Definition of a meta game is any strategy, action, or method used in a game which transcends a prescribed rule set, uses external factors to affect the game, or goes beyond the supposed limits or environments set by the game. So there's a newfound interest in these games such as Settlers of Catan, which are using mechanics and dynamics in new and revolutionary ways. But as a game designer, it's still incredibly difficult to get your game published. The old way, before the invention of Kickstarter, was to develop a polished prototype of your game, send it to the publishers, attend game conferences. Very few games actually made it to market this way. It's expensive to develop your prototype. You have to travel to all these conferences, and there's no indication of interest in your game from the public before it's actually released. This all changed with the launch of the crowdfunding website Kickstarter in 2009. Game designers could market, test interest in the game by creating a Kickstarter campaign to test their ideas, build an audience, get some excitement going for your game, and see if people are willing to commit real money to a game before it's fully manufactured and launched. It also allows designers to self-publish rather than having to sell the games to a publisher. I'm going to be doing a tutorial later in this series on how to put together a Kickstarter campaign. There are actually more funded board games through crowdfunding sites than there are video games. 196 million has been invested in board games and 180 million has been invested in video games. So it's definitely really is responsible for this new boom in the board game market. So that's a brief look at non-digital games or board games. It's not an exhaustive look by any means, but covered a few of the important developments in the board game market. Next, we're going to go on to have a look at a brief history of video games.